Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Invisible Man. The mop bucket hit the marble floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the pristine hallways of Technova Industries. Dustin Gonzalez watched the soapy water spread across the expensive Italian tiles as 26-year-old CO Brent Carpenter stood over him, designer shoes now splashed with cleaning solution. Worthless, Brent spat, adjusting his silk tie. You can't even keep your bucket upright. Maybe you should find work more suited to your capabilities. Dustin slowly rose to his full 6-foot frame, his weathered hands gripping the mop handle. At 52, he'd learned the art of patience, though his steel-gray eyes held depths that Brent Carpenter had never bothered to notice. "I'll clean it up right away, Mr. Carpenter. See that you do." Brent's voice carried the entitled arrogance of someone who'd never faced real adversity. "And next time, try not to be so clumsy. This building has standards." As Brent strutted away, his perfectly styled blonde hair catching the LED lighting, Dustin began mopping with methodical precision. To the security cameras and passing employees, he was just another janitor, invisible, insignificant, forgotten. But Dustin Gonzalez had spent the last 18 months perfecting this performance. The irony wasn't lost on him. Brent Carpenter, the golden boy of Silicon Valley, had built his reputation on Technova's revolutionary cloud computing platform. What he didn't know was that the building he strutted through so arrogantly, the company he claimed to have revolutionized, and the very technologies that made him famous, all belonged to Dustin. 3 years ago, Dustin had been known as DG Gonzalez, the reclusive tech mogul who'd founded and sold 4 companies before his 40th birthday. His investment firm, Gonzalez Ventures, held stakes in dozens of tech startups. Technova had been one of his earliest investments, back when it was just 3 programmers in a garage. But Dustin had grown tired of the spotlight, the endless board meetings, the Silicon Valley politics. After his wife Maria died in a car accident, an accident caused by a drunk driver who happened to be the son of a powerful tech executive who buried the story, Dustin had withdrawn from public life. He'd placed his assets in trust, appointed managers, and disappeared. Except he hadn't really disappeared. He'd been watching, learning, planning. Brent Carpenter had wormed his way into Technova through his father's connections. Richard Carpenter, a venture capitalist with more ambition than ethics, had leveraged his network to install his son as CEO when the company's founders were forced out through a hostile takeover that Dustin now knew had been orchestrated through insider trading and market manipulation. The real genius of Dustin's plan wasn't just reclaiming what was his. It was ensuring that justice was served for every person Brent had stepped on during his meteoric rise. The young programmer who'd been fired for refusing to work 90-hour weeks. The whistleblower who tried to expose safety violations and found himself blacklisted. The janitor before Dustin who'd been terminated for accidentally walking into a meeting room. As Dustin finished cleaning the spilled water, he noticed Jake Morgan approaching. Jake was Technova's head of security, a sharp-eyed former military man who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to corporate security. Unlike most of the Technova employees, Jake treated Dustin with respect. "You all right, Dustin?" Jake asked, his voice carrying genuine concern. "Just another day in paradise," Dustin replied with a wry smile. "How's your daughter doing?" Jake's expression brightened. "Sarah's doing great. Got accepted to MIT for computer science. Still can't believe I'll be able to afford it." Dustin nodded approvingly. What Jake didn't know was that an anonymous scholarship, one that would cover Sarah's full tuition and living expenses, had been established in her name the previous month. Dustin had learned long ago that loyalty was earned through kindness, not just payroll. "Mr. Morgan." Brent's voice carried down the hallway. "My office." "Now." Jake's jaw tightened slightly. "Duty calls. See you around, Dustin." As Jake walked away, Dustin continued his cleaning routine, his mind working through the intricate web he'd been weaving. In his custodial cart, hidden beneath cleaning supplies, was a tablet connected to a secure network that gave him access to information that would make most corporate espionage experts weep with envy. He knew about Brent's cocaine habit, carefully hidden from the board. He knew about the company funds being funneled to offshore accounts. He knew about the stolen intellectual property that formed the backbone of Technova's latest product line. Most importantly, he knew about the meeting scheduled for next week. The meeting where Brent planned to sell Technova to Meridian Corp for $500 million. What Brent didn't know was that Meridian Corp was a shell company owned by a subsidiary of a holding company that ultimately traced back to Gonzalez Ventures. In 1 week, Dustin would own Technova completely, and Brent Carpenter would learn what it felt like to be truly powerless. But first, Dustin had a few more pieces to move into position. Chapter 2. The Setup. The next morning, Dustin arrived at Technova at 5 a.m., 2 hours before the earliest employees. His janitor's uniform and ID badge got him past security without a second glance. But the real work began once he was alone in the building. Moving through the executive floor with practiced silence, Dustin made his way to Brent's corner office. The lock was a high-end electronic system, but Dustin had spent 30 years in tech. There wasn't a security system he couldn't bypass given enough time and motivation. Inside Brent's office, Dustin worked quickly. He planted 3 devices, a keylogger disguised as a USB charging port, a microphone the size of a pinhead hidden behind Brent's executive photo, and a microscopic camera embedded in the frame of his MBA diploma from Harvard, a degree that Dustin's research had revealed was purchased rather than earned. As dawn broke over San Francisco Bay, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dustin reflected on the path that had brought him here. After Maria's death, he'd spent 2 years in a dark place, drinking too much and caring too little. It was his daughter, Carolina Gonzalez, who'd finally pulled him back from the brink. Carolina worked as an investigative journalist for the San Francisco Chronicle, specializing in corporate corruption. She'd been researching Technova for a series on Silicon Valley nepotism when she discovered the web of lies and stolen innovations that had built Brent's empire. When she'd shared her findings with her father, she'd unknowingly provided the final piece of Dustin's plan. The beauty of it was that Brent's downfall would come from his own hubris. Every cruel word, every humiliation, every act of callous disregard had been recorded, documented, and cataloged. Dustin wasn't just seeking revenge. He was building a case that would destroy Brent's reputation so completely that he'd never recover. The sound of an elevator interrupted Dustin's thoughts. He quickly finished his work and exited through a service corridor, making it to the main lobby just as Warren Wright, Technova's CFO, walked through the front doors. Warren was different from Brent, older, more cautious, and increasingly uncomfortable with his CEO's erratic behavior. Dustin had been studying Warren for months, and he knew the man was looking for an exit strategy. Warren's wife had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer, and he wanted to spend his remaining years with her rather than covering for an unstable boss. "Morning, Dustin," Warren said, surprising the janitor with his acknowledgement. Most executives walked past without seeing him. "Good morning, Mr. Wright. I hope Mrs. Wright is feeling better." Warren paused, his expression softening. "You remembered. Thank you. She's responding well to treatment. That's wonderful news. Cancer's a tough fight, but she strikes me as a tough lady." "She is indeed." Warren studied Dustin for a moment. "You know, you're wasted in custodial work. You've got good instincts about people." If only he knew, Dustin thought. "I appreciate that, Mr. Wright. Sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan." After Warren disappeared into the elevator, Dustin continued his morning routine. By 7 a.m., he'd established what he called his intelligence network throughout the building. The night security guard, Pete Murray, owed Dustin a favor after Dustin had helped him through a gambling addiction by connecting him with counseling services. The receptionist, Marlene Scott, appreciated Dustin's kindness to her elderly mother, who sometimes visited the office. Even the cafeteria manager, Carl McMahon, had been won over by Dustin's respectful treatment of the food service staff. Each of these relationships had been cultivated carefully, not through manipulation, but through genuine kindness and respect. Dustin had learned long ago that the people who kept businesses running, the security guards, receptionists, maintenance staff, and food service workers, often saw and heard more than the executives realized. At 9:30 a.m., Brent made his grand entrance, as was his custom. He swept through the lobby like a conquering hero, his entourage of assistants and sycophants trailing behind him. Today's ensemble was a $3,000 suit with Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Marlene," Brent snapped at the receptionist, "I need the conference room prepped for the Meridian meeting. And make sure the cleaning staff doesn't leave any streaks on the windows. I don't want those investors thinking we can't maintain basic standards." "Of course, Mr. Carpenter," Marlene replied professionally, though Dustin caught the slight tightening around her eyes. As Brent's group moved toward the elevator, Dustin began mopping nearby, his presence so routine that they spoke freely around him. "Are we sure about the Meridian deal?" asked Jennifer Walsh, Technova's head of legal. "The due diligence timeline seems rushed." "Jennifer, darling," Brent said with condescension that made Dustin's jaw clench, "when you've been in business as long as I have, you learn to recognize opportunity. Meridian wants to close fast, and frankly, $500 million is more than this company's worth anyway." Rich Black, the company's head of R&D, shifted uncomfortably. "What about the team? Most of these people have been here since the beginning." "Most of these people are deadweight," Brent replied dismissively. "Meridian will bring in their own people. It's called evolution, Rich. Adapt or become extinct." As the elevator doors closed, Dustin caught Jennifer's eye. She looked troubled, and Dustin filed that observation away. Jennifer Walsh had a reputation for integrity in a field where it was often in short supply. She might be an ally when the time came. That afternoon, Dustin received a text message on his secure phone. "Package delivered." CGE, Carolina had successfully planted her own sources within Meridian Corp, or rather, within the investment firm that was posing as Meridian Corporation. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But as Dustin emptied trash cans on the executive floor, he overheard a conversation that changed everything. Brent was on a phone call, and his voice carried clearly through his poorly soundproofed office door. "No, Dad, I'm not worried about the SEC investigation. By the time they figure out what happened with the Patterson acquisition, I'll be in the Caymans with my money. Warren doesn't know anything, and even if he did, who's going to believe him over me?" Dustin's blood ran cold. Warren Wright wasn't just an unwitting accomplice. He was being set up as a fall guy. And from what Dustin could piece together, the Patterson acquisition referred to a biotech startup that Technova had acquired 6 months ago under suspicious circumstances. This changed the timeline completely. Dustin had planned to let Brent dig his own grave slowly, but if Warren was about to be destroyed in the process, immediate action was required. It was time to accelerate the plan. Chapter 3. The Acceleration. The emergency board meeting was called for Thursday afternoon, just 2 days before the scheduled Meridian acquisition. Dustin had spent the previous 48 hours in a whirlwind of activity, calling in favors and activating contingency plans he'd hoped never to use. His first call had been to Carolina, who'd immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Dad, if they're planning to pin financial crimes on Warren Wright, we need to move fast. I can have the story ready to publish by tomorrow morning." "Not yet," Dustin had replied. "If we show our hand too early, Brent will just find another scapegoat. We need to wait until he's committed to his course of action." The second call had been more difficult. Glenn Baxter was a private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud, and his services didn't come cheap. But Dustin needed irrefutable evidence of the Patterson acquisition irregularities, and he needed it within 24 hours. "You're asking me to perform miracles, Gonzalez," Glenn had said. "This kind of deep dive usually takes weeks. I'll pay triple your usual rate, plus a bonus if you find what I think you'll find." "Jesus, you really want to bury this guy, don't you?" "I want to save an innocent man and expose a criminal. The burial is just a pleasant side effect." Now, as Thursday afternoon arrived, Dustin positioned himself strategically throughout the building. The board meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. in a large conference room on the 15th floor. Dustin had volunteered to do deep cleaning on that floor, giving him legitimate access to the area. The board members began arriving at 2:45. Dustin recognized most of them from his research: old money venture capitalists, tech industry veterans, and a few token diversity appointments who rarely spoke up. What they didn't know was that one of them, Dr. Megan Myers, was actually Dustin's hand-picked representative who'd been quietly buying up board positions through shell companies for the past year. Dr. Myers was a former Stanford professor who'd made her fortune in early internet investments. More importantly, she was a woman of uncompromising integrity who'd agreed to serve as Dustin's inside voice once she'd learned the full scope of Brent's crimes. Warren Wright looked haggard as he entered the conference room, carrying a briefcase that Dustin suspected contained evidence of the very crimes Brent planned to pin on him. Warren's loyalty to the company ran deep, but Dustin could see the stress wearing on him. Brent, by contrast, was in his element. He dressed in his most expensive suit and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. As he settled into his chair at the head of the conference table, Dustin activated the listening devices he'd planted and began monitoring the meeting through his hidden tablet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brent began, "thank you for attending on such short notice. I've called this emergency session because we've uncovered some irregularities in our financial reporting that need immediate attention." Dustin's jaw tightened. It was beginning. "Warren," Brent continued, turning to his CFO with false sympathy, "I know this is difficult, but could you explain to the board what you discovered about the Patterson acquisition?" Warren looked genuinely confused. "I'm not sure what you mean, Brent. The Patterson acquisition was handled entirely by your office. I only saw the final paperwork for approval. Come now, Warren. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We have evidence of financial improprieties in that deal, and your signature is on most of the documents." Dr. Myers spoke up, her voice sharp. "What kind of evidence are we talking about, Mr. Carpenter?" Brent smiled coldly. "Stock manipulation, inflated valuation reports, and possible kickbacks to securing the deal. The SEC has already been notified." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Warren's face went white. That's impossible. Every document I signed was prepared by your team and pre-approved by legal." "That's not what the documentation shows," Brent replied smoothly. "Jennifer, could you present the findings?" Jennifer Walsh looked deeply uncomfortable as she opened her laptop. "I need to state for the record that this investigation was conducted without my knowledge or approval. The documents presented to me yesterday." "Just present the findings, Jennifer," Brent interrupted. As Jennifer reluctantly began outlining a case that had clearly been manufactured to implicate Warren, Dustin made his move. He sent a single text message, "Now." 3 minutes later, Glenn Baxter walked into the conference room, followed by 2 FBI agents and Carolina Gonzalez with her camera crew from the Chronicle. "What the hell is this?" Brent demanded, his composure cracking for the first time. "Mr. Carpenter," said Agent Terry Carey, "we're here to execute a search warrant for documents related to the Patterson acquisition. We have reason to believe that fraudulent documents have been planted to incriminate an innocent party." As chaos erupted in the conference room, Dustin calmly finished mopping the hallway outside, listening to Brent's increasingly desperate protests through his earpiece. "This is outrageous. Warren Wright is the one you should be investigating. I have documentation." "Yes, we've seen your documentation," Agent Carey replied. "Unfortunately for you, we've also seen the real documentation, including email records showing that you personally ordered the creation of false evidence to frame Mr. Wright." Dr. Myers stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. "A motion for an immediate vote of no confidence in CEO Brent Carpenter." "Seconded," said another board member quickly. "You can't do this," Brent shouted. "I own this company." "Actually," Dr. Myers said with a slight smile, "you don't. According to the corporate charter, which I've had independently reviewed, Technova Industries is owned by a complex network of holding companies that ultimately trace back to its original investor. And that investor has decided it's time for new management." As FBI agents began collecting evidence, and Brent was read his rights, Dustin quietly wheeled his cart to the service elevator. Phase 1 was complete, but the real fireworks were just beginning. Tomorrow would be the day that Brent Carpenter learned who really owned Technova Industries. And it would be the day that Dustin Gonzalez stepped out of the shadows to claim what was rightfully his. Chapter 4: The Investigation. The Technova building buzzed with controlled chaos as federal agents methodically dismantled Brent Carpenter's empire of lies. Dustin continued his janitorial duties, invisible among the investigators who treated him as part of the building's furniture. His position gave him unprecedented access to observe the unfolding drama. Agent Terry Carey had set up a temporary command center in the large conference room where the board meeting had imploded. She was a 20-year veteran of white-collar crime investigations, and her reputation for thoroughness had made her Carolina's first choice when they needed federal involvement. The scope of this fraud is staggering, Agent Carey explained to her partner, Agent Roy Eldridge, as Dustin emptied wastebaskets nearby. We're not just looking at the Patterson acquisition. There's evidence of systematic manipulation going back 3 years. Roy nodded grimly. The whistleblower's information was spot on. Whoever provided this intelligence package knew exactly where to point us. Dustin allowed himself a small smile. The whistleblower was actually a compilation of evidence from multiple sources: Carolina's investigative work, Glenn Baxter's forensic accounting, and Dustin's own careful documentation of Brent crimes. They'd packaged it all together and submitted it through an anonymous tip line, creating the appearance of a single inside source. Down the hall, Brent sat in a smaller conference room with his lawyer, Damon Peters, an expensive attorney known for defending white-collar criminals. Through the glass walls, Dustin could see Brent gesticulating wildly while Damon tried to calm him down. "You don't understand," Brent was saying, his voice carrying despite the closed door. "Someone is setting me up. This is a conspiracy." "Brent, you need to focus," Damon replied tersely. "The evidence against you is extensive. We need to discuss a plea bargain." "A plea bargain? Are you insane? I'm innocent." Damon's expression suggested he'd heard similar protests from guilty clients many times before. "The FBI has your emails, Brent. They have documentation showing you personally ordered the creation of false evidence to frame Warren Wright. They have recorded conversations from your office." Brent's face went pale. "That's impossible. My office is swept for surveillance devices monthly." What Brent didn't know was that Dustin's devices were military-grade technology, virtually undetectable by commercial security sweeps. They'd been provided by Jake Morgan, who'd quietly shared his concerns about Technova's direction with his old military contacts. In another part of the building, Warren Wright sat with his own attorney, looking shell-shocked but relieved. Jennifer Walsh was providing testimony to federal investigators, her legal training making her an invaluable witness to the document fraud scheme. "Mr. Wright," Agent Carey said gently, "I want you to understand that you're not under investigation. You're a victim here. Mr. Carpenter attempted to frame you for crimes he committed." Warren's voice was shaky. "I don't understand how this happened. Brent and I worked together for 2 years. I thought we were friends. Mr. Carpenter appears to have a pattern of using people and discarding them when convenient," Agent Eldridge explained. "You're not his first victim, and based on what we're uncovering, you wouldn't have been his last." As the day progressed, Dustin watched the methodical destruction of Brent's criminal enterprise. The Patterson acquisition was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators had uncovered embezzlement, securities fraud, insider trading, and patent theft. Each revelation made Brent's position more hopeless. At 6 p.m., as most of the investigators were wrapping up for the day, Dr. Megan Myers approached Dustin in the hallway. To any observer, it would look like a brief conversation between a board member and a janitor. "The emergency board meeting is rescheduled for tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "We'll need to elect an interim CEO and begin damage control." "How was the staff handling everything?" Dustin asked, maintaining his cover. "Better than expected. Most people suspected something was wrong with Brent's leadership. They're actually relieved that the truth is finally coming out." Dr. Myers paused, then added, "There's something else. The Meridian acquisition is obviously canceled, but we've received 3 other offers in the past 6 hours. Word travels fast in Silicon Valley." Dustin nodded. "What kind of offers?" "All cash, all above our previous valuation. Apparently, companies are more interested in Technova without Brent Carpenter attached to it." This was exactly what Dustin had hoped for. With Brent removed and the criminal elements exposed, Technova's true value would become apparent. The company's core technology and talented workforce had always been its real assets. That evening, Dustin met with Carolina at a small restaurant near the Chronicle building. She looked exhausted but triumphant. Her story about the Technova scandal would run in tomorrow's edition and likely win her a Pulitzer nomination. "Dad, the scope of this thing is incredible," she said, pulling up notes on her tablet. Brent wasn't just stealing from Technova. He was using the company as a front for a larger fraud scheme involving at least 6 other companies. "What do you mean?" "Remember the Patterson acquisition? Patterson Biotech was developing a revolutionary cancer treatment. Brent acquired them using inflated Technova stock as currency, then buried their research and sold off their assets. People died because that treatment never made it to market." Dustin's jaw tightened. Maria had died from the same type of cancer that Patterson Biotech had been researching. The personal nature of Brent's crimes went deeper than he'd realized. "There's more," Carolina continued. "Glenn Baxter found evidence that Brent's been working with organized crime figures to manipulate stock prices. The FBI is treating this as a RICO case now. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. If proven, it would mean decades in federal prison for everyone involved." "What about the other victims?" Dustin asked. "That's the beautiful part. The FBI is using Brent's own records to identify everyone he's defrauded over the past 5 years. They're looking at potentially hundreds of victims and millions in restitution." As they finished dinner, Carolina studied her father carefully. Throughout this entire investigation, I kept feeling like someone was feeding me information, like there was an intelligence network already in place." Dustin maintained his poker face. "Good investigative journalists develop sources everywhere. Maybe, or maybe someone who really understood the tech industry had been planning this for a long time." "What makes you say that?" Carolina smiled. "Because every piece of evidence we needed appeared exactly when we needed it. Every source we required became available at the perfect moment. Either we're the luckiest journalists in history, or someone very smart has been orchestrating this entire operation." Dustin finished his coffee. "Sometimes justice requires patience and planning." "Indeed it does. But tomorrow should be interesting. I hear Technova's board is meeting to elect new leadership. Any idea who they're considering?" Carolina's smile widened. "Word is they want someone with extensive tech industry experience, unquestionable integrity, and a vision for rebuilding the company's reputation. Someone who understands both the technical and business sides of the industry. That's a tall order. Maybe, but I have a feeling the right candidate will emerge." As Dustin drove home that night, he reflected on how far the plan had progressed. Brent Carpenter was facing federal charges that would likely result in a life sentence. Warren Wright had been cleared of all suspicion and would likely emerge as a key witness for the prosecution. Technova's reputation was being rehabilitated as the true scope of Brent's crimes became public. But the most important phase was still to come. Tomorrow, Dustin would finally step out of the shadows and reclaim what had always been his. After 18 months of patient planning and careful maneuvering, the endgame was finally at hand. Chapter 5, The Revelation. Friday morning arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation throughout Technova Industries. The building was swarming with media crews covering the biggest corporate scandal to hit Silicon Valley in years. Dustin arrived for his usual 5 a.m. shift, but today his janitorial cart contained more than cleaning supplies. Hidden beneath the false bottom was a tailored charcoal suit, Italian leather shoes, and a briefcase containing documents that would reshape Technova's future. Today, Dustin Gonzalez would shed his invisible identity and reclaim his rightful place in the business world. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., but Dustin had preparations to make first. He made his way to the executive washroom on the 15th floor, where he began his transformation. The janitorial uniform came off, replaced by the expensive suit. Contact lenses replaced his reading glasses. A quick shave and styled hair completed the metamorphosis. Looking in the mirror, Dustin saw not the humble janitor who'd been invisible for 18 months, but D.G. Gonzalez, the tech mogul who'd built and sold 4 companies before his 40th birthday. The man who'd revolutionized cloud computing and artificial intelligence before most people even understood what those terms meant. At 9:45 a.m., Dustin made his way to the conference room where the board had assembled. Dr. Megan Myers caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Warren Wright looked healthier than he had in months. The stress of carrying Brent's secrets finally lifted from his shoulders. Jennifer Walsh sat confidently, no longer forced to enable criminal behavior. Even the other board members seemed more relaxed without Brent's toxic presence, poisoning every interaction. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Myers called the meeting to order. We're here to address the leadership crisis at Teknova Industries. As you all know, our former CEO is facing federal charges, and we need to elect an interim replacement immediately. Board member Carl McMahon raised his hand. Do we have any candidates prepared for consideration? Actually, we do, Dr. Myers replied. But first, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Teknova's ownership structure. She activated the room's presentation system, displaying a complex corporate org chart. As many of you know, Teknova's majority ownership has always been held through a series of shell companies and investment vehicles. What you may not know is that these companies ultimately trace back to a single beneficial owner. Murmurs rippled through the room. Several board members exchanged confused glances. Yesterday, I received documentation from Teknova's true majority shareholder, Dr. Myers continued, someone who has been observing our company's operations for quite some time. At that moment, Dustin entered the conference room, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Warren Wright's jaw dropped. Jennifer Walsh gasped audibly. Even Dr. Myers, who'd been expecting this moment, seemed struck by the dramatic transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dustin said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, allow me to introduce myself properly. I'm D.G. Gonzalez, founder and managing partner of Gonzalez Ventures and majority owner of Teknova Industries. The silence was deafening. Dustin set his briefcase on the table and began removing documents. For the past 18 months, I've been working in this building under an assumed identity, observing operations and gathering evidence of criminal activity. What I discovered exceeded my worst expectations. Warren found his voice first. You're the janitor. I was playing the role of a janitor, yes. It's remarkable how invisible service workers become to people who consider themselves important. I learned more about this company's operations in 18 months of emptying trash cans than most board members learned in years of meetings. Jennifer Walsh was studying Dustin with the sharp eyes of a corporate attorney. D.G. Gonzalez disappeared from public view 3 years ago. There were rumors about personal tragedy. My wife Maria died in a car accident, Dustin said simply. The driver was drunk, and his family's connections ensured the story was buried. I decided to step back from public life and reassess my priorities. He opened his briefcase and began distributing documents. These are the ownership papers for Teknova Industries. As you can see, Gonzalez Ventures holds 63% of the company's shares, making me the majority owner. I also hold controlling interests in the building we're sitting in and the parking garage across the street. Dr. Myers spoke up. Mr. Gonzalez, perhaps you could explain how you discovered the extent of Mr. Carpenter's criminal activities? Dustin smiled grimly. Brent Carpenter made one crucial mistake. He assumed that power came from position rather than preparation. While he was busy intimidating employees and manipulating books, I was documenting every conversation, every transaction, every act of corruption. He activated his tablet, and the room's speakers crackled to life with a recording of Brent's voice. Warren doesn't know anything, and even if he did, who's going to believe him over me? By the time the SEC figures out what happened with the Patterson acquisition, I'll be in the Caymans with my money. Warren's face went white with anger. He was planning to frame me and flee the country? That was just one of several contingency plans, Dustin replied. Brent had similar schemes prepared for other employees. He viewed all of you as expendable. The room erupted in angry murmurs. Board member after board member expressed shock at the depth of Brent's betrayal. The question now, Dustin continued, is how we move forward. Technova has exceptional technology and talented people, but we need leadership that can rebuild trust and restore our reputation. Warren Wright leaned forward. Mr. Gonzalez, if you're the majority owner, you have the right to appoint a new CEO directly. That's true, Dustin agreed. But I believe in collaborative leadership. I'd like the board's input on the direction we should take. Jennifer Walsh studied the ownership documents. These appear legitimate, but I'll need time to verify the chain of ownership through all these shell companies. Of course, Glenn Baxter is standing by to provide additional documentation if needed. Dr. Myers spoke up. Assuming these documents are authentic, what are your intentions for Technova? Dustin stood and walked to the windows overlooking San Francisco Bay. Technova was always intended to be more than just another tech company. Our original mission was to democratize technology and make advanced computing accessible to everyone. Under Brent's leadership, we lost sight of that vision. He turned back to the room. I propose we return to our roots. We'll honor all employee contracts, restore the research and development budget that Brent slashed, and implement the Patterson Biotech cancer treatment research that he buried. The room fell silent again. Warren was the first to speak. You're talking about rebuilding the company from the ground up. I'm talking about fulfilling the promise that Technova always had, but never realized. We have the resources, the talent, and now we have leadership that isn't criminally insane. Dr. Myers called for a formal vote. All in favor of accepting D.G. Gonzalez as Technova's interim CEO and majority owner? The vote was unanimous. As the meeting concluded, Dustin reflected on the irony of the situation. 18 months ago, he'd entered this building as an invisible janitor seeking justice for his wife's death and the countless victims of corporate corruption. Now he was walking out as the CEO of a company worth $500 million, with the power to ensure that justice was not only served, but that future victims would be protected. But the most satisfying moment was still to come. In 1 hour, Brent Carpenter would arrive for what he believed was the Meridian acquisition meeting, expecting to walk away with $500 million and his freedom. Instead, he would learn that his victim had been pulling the strings all along. Chapter 6: The Meridian Deception. The large conference room had been transformed for what Brent Carpenter believed would be the most important meeting of his life. Despite being on bail and facing federal charges, his legal team had managed to keep the Meridian acquisition on track, or so they thought. Dustin sat at the head of the conference table, no longer disguised as a janitor, but fully revealed as D.G. Gonzalez, majority owner and newly appointed CEO of Technova Industries. Beside him sat his attorney, Julio Bartlett, one of the most respected corporate lawyers in California. Warren Wright, now serving as CFO without the shadow of false accusations, reviewed documents with visible relief. At exactly 2 p.m., Brent entered the conference room with his entourage. His face was drawn from stress, but he maintained the arrogant swagger that had defined his brief reign as CEO. His lawyer, Damon Peters, looked skeptical about the entire proceeding. Brent stopped dead when he saw Dustin at the head of the table. "What the hell is the janitor doing here?" Brent demanded, his voice carrying the same contempt he'd shown for 18 months. "Please have a seat, Mr. Carpenter," Dustin said calmly. "We have a lot to discuss. I'm not sitting down until someone explains why there's cleaning staff in my board meeting." Warren Wright cleared his throat. "Brent, I'd like you to meet D.G. Gonzalez, the majority owner of Technova Industries and our new CEO." The color drained from Brent's face. "That's impossible. The janitor's name is Dustin Gonzalez." "Dustin is a nickname for D.G.," Dustin explained patiently. "David Gustavo Gonzalez, to be precise. Though most people in the tech industry know me simply as D.G." Brent's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Brent waved him off. "This is some kind of joke. The real D.G. Gonzalez disappeared years ago." "I took a sabbatical," Dustin corrected. "I needed time to process my wife's death and reassess my priorities. During that time, I decided to observe how my investments were being managed." Technova was particularly concerning. Recognition dawned in Brent's eyes, followed immediately by rage. "You've been spying on me. I've been observing criminal activity and gathering evidence. There's a difference. Damon Peters leaned forward. Mr. Gonzalez, if that's really who you are, this meeting is highly irregular. My client was expecting to finalize the Meridian acquisition. Dustin smiled coldly. About that, I have some news regarding Meridian Corporation. He activated the presentation screen, displaying Meridian's corporate structure. Meridian Corp is a subsidiary of Pinnacle Holdings, which is owned by Strategic Investments LLC, which ultimately traces back to Gonzalez Ventures. I am Meridian Corporation. The room fell silent except for the sound of Brent's heavy breathing. The $500 million offer, Warren asked, beginning to understand. Was always my money, Dustin confirmed. I was planning to buy Technova back for myself, which would have been an interesting accounting exercise. Fortunately, recent events have made that unnecessary. Brent slammed his hand on the table. You son of a bitch. This whole thing was a setup. This whole thing was justice, Dustin replied evenly. For my wife, who died because drunk drivers with connections can buy their way out of consequences. For Warren, who you plan to frame for your crimes. For every employee you mistreated and every investor you defrauded. He stood and walked to the windows overlooking the city. For 18 months, I watched you destroy everything good about this company. You fired talented engineers for refusing to work 100-hour weeks. You buried life-saving medical research because it wasn't profitable enough. You stole ideas from smaller companies and destroyed their founders' lives. Turning back to face Brent, Dustin's voice carried quiet fury. But the worst part was your casual cruelty. The way you treated people you consider beneath you. The assumption that power gave you the right to humiliate and degrade anyone who couldn't fight back. Brent's face was red with rage. You can't do this. I have contracts. I have rights. You have debts, Warren Wright interjected, sliding a thick folder across the table. These are the financial irregularities we've uncovered since the FBI investigation began. Embezzlement, unauthorized stock grants to yourself, expense account fraud. The list goes on for 47 pages. Jennifer Walsh spoke up from her position near the door. Mr. Carpenter, you should also know that the board voted this morning to terminate your employment for cause. Your severance package, stock options, and benefits are all forfeit. This is illegal, Brent shouted. I'll sue all of you. Julio Bartlett, Dustin's attorney, smiled. With what money? The FBI has frozen your assets as part of their investigation. And given that you're facing federal racketeering charges, I doubt you'll be in a position to file lawsuits anytime soon. Damon Peters looked defeated. Brent, we need to leave. Now. No. Brent's composure finally cracked completely. This is my company. I built this. I made Technova what it is. You nearly destroyed it, Dustin said quietly. But Technova will survive and thrive because its real value was never in your leadership. It was in the technology we created and the people who believed in our mission. As if on cue, Jake Morgan appeared in the doorway with 2 security guards. Mr. Carpenter, I need to escort you from the building. Your access has been revoked. Brent looked around the room wildly, as if searching for allies. He found none. Even his own lawyer was packing up documents and preparing to leave. This isn't over, Brent snarled at Dustin. I know people. I have connections. You can't just. Your connections are either under federal investigation or distancing themselves from you as quickly as possible, Dustin interrupted. Your father's venture capital firm issued a statement this morning disavowing any knowledge of your activities. Your country club membership has been suspended. Your penthouse apartment is being foreclosed on because the bank discovered it was purchased with embezzled funds. He paused, letting the full impact sink in. It's over, Brent. The only question now is whether you cooperate with federal investigators or spend the rest of your life in prison. As Jake Morgan escorted Brent from the building, the same man who'd treated Dustin with respect when he was just a janitor, Dustin felt a sense of completion. Not satisfaction, exactly, but the knowledge that justice had been served. Warren Wright approached him as the room cleared. What happens now? Now we rebuild, Dustin said. We honor our commitments to employees and investors. We restart the Patterson biotech research. We remember what Technova was supposed to be before Brent Carpenter corrupted it. And you? Will you stay on as CEO? Dustin looked out at the city where he'd built his fortune, lost his wife, and found his purpose again. For now. But Technova's future depends on developing the next generation of leaders. People like you, Jennifer, and the engineers Brent tried to drive away. As the afternoon sun streamed through the conference room windows, Dustin reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. From the depths of grief to the satisfaction of justice served, from the invisibility of service work to the responsibility of leadership. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, rebuilding trust, restoring innovation, and ensuring that the values that had driven Technova's founding would guide its future. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Dustin Gonzalez would sleep peacefully, knowing that his wife's death had not been in vain and that the corrupt system that had protected her killer was a little less powerful. The janitor's gambit was complete. Chapter 7. The Boardroom Confrontation. The Monday morning following Brent's removal arrived with unprecedented media attention. News crews lined the street outside Technova Industries as word spread about the dramatic revelation of DG Gonzalez's true identity. Inside the building, employees whispered excitedly about their mysterious janitor's transformation into a tech billionaire. Dustin arrived through the executive entrance for the first time in 18 months, greeting Marlene Scott with a smile that she returned warmly. The news of his true identity had spread quickly through the building's informal network, and the reception from staff had been overwhelmingly positive. "Mr. Gonzalez," Marlene said professionally, though her eyes sparkled with excitement, "you have several messages from reporters, 3 calls from venture capital firms, and Warren, where I would like to see you when you have a moment." "Thank you, Marlene. And please continue calling me Dustin. I may own the company, but I haven't forgotten the people who made me feel welcome when I was just the janitor." As Dustin made his way to the executive floor, he was stopped repeatedly by employees who wanted to thank him for removing Brent and express their relief about the company's new direction. Pete Murray, the night security guard, pulled him aside near the elevators. "Dustin, I just wanted to say thanks," Pete said quietly. "Not just for getting rid of Carpenter, but for what you did for me last year. The counseling program you helped me find, it saved my marriage. You did the hard work, Pete. I just pointed you in the right direction. Yeah, but you saw me as a person worth helping." Carpenter looked right through me like I didn't exist. The contrast between leadership styles couldn't have been sharper. Where Brent had ruled through fear and intimidation, Dustin had built loyalty through genuine concern for people's welfare. In Warren Wright's office, Dustin found his CFO reviewing financial projections with a sense of optimism that had been absent for months. "The numbers are actually better than I expected," Warren reported. "Once we factor out Brent's embezzlement and fraudulent expenses, Technova is remarkably healthy. We have enough cash reserves to restart the Patterson research and hire back the engineers Brent fired. What about the federal investigation? Any impact on our operations?" "Surprisingly minimal. Agent Carey has been very professional about distinguishing between evidence of Brent's crimes and normal business operations. If anything, the investigation has helped us identify areas where Brent was hiding problems." Dr. Megan Myers knocked on the open door frame. "Dustin, do you have a few minutes? There's something you need to see." They walked to the conference room, where a large screen displayed news coverage from various networks. Every major business channel was covering the Technova story, and the narrative was uniformly positive. Technova's dramatic transformation from scandal-ridden corporation to redemption story is captivating Silicon Valley, reported one anchor. The revelation that tech mogul DG Gonzalez spent 18 months working undercover as a janitor to expose corruption has turned him into an overnight folk hero. Another channel showed Warren Wright being interviewed outside the building. "DG Gonzalez saved my career and possibly my life," Warren was saying. "Brent Carpenter was planning to frame me for crimes I had no knowledge of. Without Dustin's intervention, I'd be facing federal charges right now." The most surprising coverage came from TechCrunch, where Carolina Gonzalez was being interviewed about her investigative reporting on the scandal. This story began with employee tips about suspicious activities, Carolina explained without revealing her relationship to Dustin. But what made it special was discovering that someone inside the company had been documenting evidence for months. The depth of preparation was unlike anything I've seen in corporate investigations. Dr. Myers turned off the screen. The market is responding very positively. Our stock price has increased 40% since the story broke. 3 major clients who were considering leaving have renewed their contracts. What about acquisition offers? Dustin asked. 7 so far, ranging from $600 million to $1.2 billion. But I think we should focus on internal growth rather than selling. Dustin nodded. Agreed. Technova has too much potential to hand over to another corporate buyer who might not understand our mission. At 10 a.m., they gathered in the large conference room for what would become known as the New Direction meeting. The entire senior staff was present, along with several engineers who'd been fired by Brent and recently rehired. Jennifer Walsh stood first. I've completed the legal review of all contracts and agreements made during Brent's tenure. Several partnerships will need to be renegotiated, but nothing that can't be handled. Rich Black, the head of R&D, looked more energetic than he had in months. We're ready to restart the Patterson Biotech research. I've already contacted 3 of the scientists who were let go when Brent shuttered the program. They're all interested in returning. Carl McMahon from Facilities Management spoke up. We've also had requests from former employees who left because of Brent's hostile work environment. Word is spreading that Technova is becoming a good place to work again. Dustin looked around the room at faces that showed hope instead of fear for the first time in years. The most important thing we can do now is prove that this transformation is real and permanent. We're not just changing leadership, we're changing culture. He stood and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. Let's talk about our core values going forward. As the meeting progressed, Dustin found himself energized by the collaborative atmosphere. Ideas flowed freely, with everyone contributing suggestions for improving operations, employee relations, and product development. At noon, Marlene Scott's voice came over the intercom. Mr. Gonzalez, Agent Carey is here to see you. Agent Terry Carey entered with a folder and a satisfied expression. I wanted to update you on the federal investigation. Brent Carpenter's case is proceeding rapidly. His lawyer is already discussing plea bargains. What about the other victims? We've identified 43 individuals and companies that were defrauded over the past 3 years. Total damages exceed $60 million. The restitution process will take time, but most victims will recover a significant portion of their losses. She opened her folder and pulled out a photograph. We also found this in Brent's personal safe. I thought you should see it. The photograph showed Brent at a party, laughing and holding a drink. In the background, barely visible, was another photo on a wall, a newspaper clipping about Maria's accident with the headline deliberately obscured except for her name. Dustin's jaw tightened. He knew. We believe so. The investigation into the drunk driving incident has been reopened. New evidence suggests the cover-up went deeper than originally thought. After Agent Carey left, Dustin sat alone in his office, looking out at the city where he'd built his life with Maria. The photograph confirmed what he'd suspected. Brent's cruelty hadn't been random. It had been targeted, personal, designed to inflict maximum pain on someone he perceived as weak and vulnerable. But Brent had made a critical error. He'd assumed that grief made people powerless, when in fact it had made Dustin more determined than ever to fight injustice wherever he found it. As the afternoon ended, Dustin walked through the building one more time, this time as CEO rather than janitor. The difference in how people treated him was striking, but he was determined not to let power corrupt his perspective the way it had corrupted Brent. Stopping by the security desk, he found Jake Morgan reviewing the day's reports. Jake, I have a question for you. When I was working as a janitor, you always treated me with respect. Why? Jake looked up thoughtfully. My dad was a janitor. Worked his whole life cleaning office buildings so I could go to college and join the military. I learned early that a person's job doesn't define their worth. That's a lesson more people should learn. Yes, sir. But I think you already knew that, even when you were pretending to be someone else. As Dustin drove home that evening, he reflected on the transformation that had taken place. not just in Technova, but in himself. The angry, grieving man who'd entered the building 18 months ago as a janitor had evolved into someone who understood that true power came not from position or wealth, but from the ability to lift others up rather than tear them down. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Technova rebuilt its reputation and Brent faced the consequences of his crimes. But tonight, Dustin Gonzalez could rest knowing that justice had been served and that his wife's memory was being honored through his work to protect others from the kind of corruption that had claimed her life. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that ended Brent Carpenter's reign of terror, Technova Industries had transformed into everything Dustin had envisioned when he first invested in the company. The Patterson Biotech Cancer Research Program was not only restored, but expanded, with promising early results that could save thousands of lives. Dustin sat in his office, the same office where Brent had once plotted to frame Warren Wright, reviewing quarterly reports that told a story of remarkable recovery. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Revenue was up 37%. Most importantly, the toxic culture that had defined Brent's era had been completely eliminated. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Carolina Gonzalez entered, no longer just an investigative journalist, but now Technova's director of corporate ethics, a position Dustin had created specifically for her. "Dad, I have updates on several fronts," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. First, the good news. The Patterson treatment just entered Phase 2 clinical trials. Dr. Megan Myers thinks we could have FDA approval within 2 years. Dustin smiled. Maria would have been proud to know her death led to something that could help other families. She would have been proud of everything you've accomplished here. Which brings me to the other news. Brent's sentencing hearing is scheduled for next week. The federal case against Brent Carpenter had proceeded with ruthless efficiency. Faced with overwhelming evidence, his legal team had negotiated a plea agreement that would send him to federal prison for 15 years. The RICO charges had been dropped in exchange for his cooperation in prosecuting his accomplices, but the sentence was still substantial enough to satisfy Dustin's sense of justice. What about restitution for the victims? The court-appointed trustee has recovered nearly $50 million from Brent's hidden assets. Most victims will be made whole, including the families of the Patterson Biotech scientists who lost their jobs. A second knock interrupted their conversation. Warren Wright entered with Jennifer Walsh, both carrying expressions of barely contained excitement. "Dustin, you need to see this," Warren said, handing him a tablet displaying a news article from the Wall Street Journal. The headline read, "Technova's Turnaround, From Corporate Scandal to Silicon Valley Success Story." The article detailed the company's remarkable transformation under Dustin's leadership, highlighting not just financial performance, but cultural change. "Listen to this quote," Jennifer said, reading from the article. "Under DG Gonzalez's leadership, Technova has become the gold standard for corporate responsibility in the tech industry. Their approach to employee relations, research ethics, and community engagement has inspired dozens of other companies to reevaluate their own practices." "It gets better," Warren added. 3 universities want to create case studies about our turnaround. Harvard Business School is requesting interviews with senior staff. Dustin shook his head in amazement. 18 months ago, I was emptying trash cans and being called worthless. Now we're being held up as a model for corporate leadership. "That's because you understood something Brent never did," Carolina observed. "Real leadership isn't about commanding respect through fear. It's about earning loyalty through service." The afternoon brought another significant development. Jake Morgan arrived with news that the reopened investigation into Maria's death had yielded results. The drunk driver's father, Richard Stankowski, has been indicted for obstruction of justice and bribery, Jake reported. Turns out he paid off 3 witnesses and bribed a police detective to minimize the charges against his son. What about the son? Dead. Overdosed 2 years ago. But knowing the truth has come out might bring some closure. As the day ended, Dustin found himself thinking about the circular nature of justice. Brent Carpenter's attempt to destroy others had ultimately led to his own destruction. The corrupt system that had protected Maria's killer was being exposed and dismantled. The company that had been poisoned by greed and cruelty was now healing and thriving. That evening, Dustin attended a company-wide gathering in the main lobby, something that would have been unthinkable during Brent's tenure. Employees mingled freely with executives, sharing ideas and celebrating their collective success. Pete Murray, the security guard whose gambling addiction Dustin had helped address, approached with his wife and teenage daughter. Mr. Gonzalez, Pete's daughter, said shyly, "I wanted to thank you for helping my dad. My parents almost got divorced because of his gambling, but the counseling program you connected him with saved our family." "Your father did the hard work," Dustin replied. "I just knew where to find help." Marlene Scott joined them, beaming with pride. "Dustin, did you hear about the employee satisfaction survey? 97% of staff say they're proud to work at Technova. That's the highest rating in the company's history." As the evening progressed, Dustin was approached by Rich Black, the head of R&D who'd been demoralized under Brent's leadership, but was now energized by Technova's renewed focus on innovation. "I have something I wanted to show you," Rich said, pulling out his tablet. "Remember that artificial intelligence project Brent canceled because he thought it was too risky? The one about early disease detection? That's the one. I've been working on it in my spare time, and I think we've had a breakthrough. The AI can now detect cancer markers in blood tests 6 months earlier than traditional methods." Dustin studied the data on the screen. This could revolutionize early intervention medicine. It could save millions of lives. And the beauty is that the technology builds on the Patterson research. Everything connects back to that original mission of using technology to improve human life. As the gathering wound down, Dustin stepped outside onto the building's terrace, looking out over the San Francisco Bay. The city lights reflected off the water, creating a pattern that reminded him of Maria's eyes when she left. Carolina joined him on the terrace. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "I was thinking about how everything led to this moment. Maria's death, my decision to go undercover, Brent's cruelty, the investigation. It all had to happen exactly the way it did for us to end up here. Do you think she would approve of what you did?" Dustin considered the question carefully. "I think she would understand that sometimes justice requires patience and planning. She always said that the best revenge against bad people was to become a better person yourself." "And have you become better?" "I hope so." The angry man who started this journey 18 months ago wanted revenge. The man I am now wants to prevent other families from going through what we did. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city settle into evening rhythms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Patterson treatment needed continued funding. The AI project required regulatory approval, and Technova's success was attracting attention from competitors who might try to poach key employees. But tonight, for the first time since Maria's death, Dustin felt genuinely at peace. Justice had been served, lives had been saved, and a company that had once represented everything wrong with corporate America had been transformed into a force for good. The janitor's gambit had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't force or money, but patience, planning, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right. Chapter 9. Justice Served. 1 year after Brent Carpenter's dramatic downfall, Technova Industries had become the most admired tech company in Silicon Valley. The transformation was so complete that business schools used it as a case study in ethical leadership and corporate redemption. Dustin stood before the assembled crowd at the annual Technova Innovation Summit, an event that brought together employees, investors, and industry leaders to showcase the company's latest developments. The venue was the same conference center where Brent had once planned to announce the fraudulent Meridian acquisition. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dustin began, his voice carrying easily across the packed auditorium. 2 years ago, Technova was a company in crisis. Corruption had poisoned our culture, fear had stifled innovation, and our mission to democratize technology had been forgotten in pursuit of short-term profits. The audience listened intently as Dustin outlined the journey that had brought them to this moment. He spoke about the importance of values-based leadership, the power of treating employees as partners rather than resources, and the responsibility that comes with technological innovation. Today, I'm proud to announce that the Patterson Biotech cancer treatment has received FDA approval for clinical use, Dustin continued. This breakthrough therapy, which was nearly lost to corporate greed, will now be available to patients worldwide at cost. No profit margins, no exploitation of human suffering. The applause was thunderous. In the front row, Dr. Megan Myers wiped away tears, thinking of the countless lives that would be saved by research that Brent Carpenter had tried to bury for financial gain. I'm also pleased to announce that our AI early detection system has been approved for widespread implementation. Starting next month, hospitals across the country will have access to technology that can identify cancer markers 6 months before traditional methods. Warren Wright, now serving as Technova's chief operating officer, took the stage to present the financial results. The numbers told a remarkable story. Revenue had doubled, employee retention was at 98%, and customer satisfaction had reached unprecedented levels. Most importantly, Warren concluded, we've proven that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive. Technova is more profitable than ever precisely because we've returned to our founding values. As the formal presentation ended, Dustin noticed a familiar figure in the back of the auditorium. Agent Terry Carey approached with a smile that suggested good news. Mr. Gonzalez, I wanted to give you a personal update on the Carpenter case. He was sentenced this morning, 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 10 years. How did he take it? About as well as you'd expect. His lawyer tried to argue for leniency based on cooperation with investigators, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. She specifically mentioned the victims who suffered because of his callous disregard for human dignity. Agent Carey paused, then added, there's something else. Remember the reopened investigation into your wife's accident? Richard Stankowski was sentenced to 5 years for obstruction of justice. The detective he bribed was fired and is facing his own charges. For the first time in 3 years, Dustin felt the weight of grief begin to lift from his shoulders. Justice hadn't brought Maria back, but it had ensured that the corrupt system that protected her killer could never harm another family the same way. As the afternoon progressed, Dustin found himself surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by Technova's transformation. Jake Morgan had been promoted to Director of Security and was using his military experience to help other veterans transition to civilian careers. Pete Murray's daughter had received a full scholarship to study computer science, funded by the Technova Foundation. Marlene Scott approached with a group of new employees, recent college graduates who'd chosen Technova specifically because of its reputation for ethical leadership. Mr. Gonzalez, one of the young engineers, said, I just wanted to thank you for creating a place where we can work on meaningful projects without compromising our values. My previous job at a startup felt like selling my soul for a paycheck. What projects are you working on? Dustin asked. Clean water technology for developing countries. Your team thinks we can create filtration systems that cost less than $50 per unit and can serve entire villages. Dustin smiled. That's exactly the kind of innovation Technova should be pursuing. Technology that improves lives rather than just generating profits. As evening approached, Dustin made his way to the building's roof terrace, where a smaller gathering was taking place. The senior staff had organized a celebration for the core team that had helped orchestrate Brent's downfall and Technova's recovery. Carolina was there with her husband and 2 young children. She'd won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on corporate corruption in Silicon Valley, using the Technova story as the centerpiece of a larger examination of systemic problems in the tech industry. Dad, I have some news, Carolina said, pulling him aside. The Chronicle wants me to head up a new investigative unit focused on corporate accountability. We'd be looking for the next Brent Carpenter before he can do the kind of damage this one did. That sounds like important work. It is, and it's work that wouldn't exist without what you did here. You've shown that corruption can be exposed and justice can be served, even when the system seems rigged against ordinary people. Dr. Megan Myers joined their conversation, carrying a glass of wine and wearing an expression of deep satisfaction. Dustin, I've been thinking about legacy lately, she said. What Brent Carpenter will be remembered for versus what you'll be remembered for. What do you mean? Brent will be remembered as a cautionary tale. A young man who had every advantage but chose cruelty and corruption over leadership and service. His name will be synonymous with corporate greed and the abuse of power. She paused, looking out over the city lights. But you'll be remembered as someone who turned personal tragedy into positive change. Someone who proved that patience and planning can triumph over arrogance and corruption. Someone who showed that true leadership means lifting others up rather than tearing them down. As the celebration continued around them, Dustin reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he'd been a broken man, consumed by grief and anger. The drunk driver who killed Maria had faced minimal consequences due to his family's wealth and connections. The system had failed utterly to deliver justice. But instead of letting that failure destroy him, Dustin had chosen to fight back in his own way. Not through violence or vigilante justice, but through patience, planning, and an unwavering commitment to exposing the truth. The 18 months he'd spent as an invisible janitor had taught him lessons that no MBA program could provide. He'd learned about the dignity of honest work, the importance of treating every person with respect, and the power that came from truly understanding an organization from the ground up. Most importantly, he learned that justice wasn't always swift, but it could be certain if pursued with sufficient determination and skill. As the evening wound down, Dustin stood alone on the terrace, looking out over the San Francisco Bay. The city lights reflected off the water, creating patterns that reminded him of Maria's eyes when she left. "I hope you're proud of what we've accomplished," he said quietly to the night air. "Your death wasn't in vain. The corrupt system that protected your killer is being dismantled piece by piece. The company that once represented everything wrong with corporate America is now saving lives and changing the world for the better." A gentle breeze stirred the air, and for a moment, Dustin could almost feel Maria's presence beside him. Not the grief-stricken memory that had haunted him for years, but the joyful, optimistic woman who believed that good people could make a difference in the world. The janitor's gambit was complete. Brent Carpenter would spend the next 15 years in federal prison. His victims had been compensated, and the corrupt networks that had enabled his crimes were being systematically exposed and prosecuted. But more than that, Technova Industries stood as proof that corporations could be forces for good when led by people who valued service over self-interest. The Patterson cancer treatment would save thousands of lives. The AI early detection system would prevent countless tragedies. The clean water technology would improve conditions for millions of people in developing countries. All of it had started with a grieving man who refused to accept that justice was beyond reach, who understood that sometimes the most powerful position isn't at the top of the corporate hierarchy, but in the invisible spaces where truth can be observed and documented. As Dustin finally headed home, he knew that Maria would be proud of the man he'd become. The angry, broken widower who'd entered Technova as a janitor 18 months ago had evolved into someone who used power to protect rather than exploit, to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. In the end, that transformation was the greatest victory of all. Brent Carpenter had sought to make himself powerful by making others feel powerless. But Dustin had learned that true power came from empowering others, and that the most lasting revenge against evil was to become a force for good in the world. Justice had been served, lives had been saved, and the circle was finally complete. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.